Out of the way, she's just a clerk! The sneer ripped across the range, laughter snapping like whips as boots shuffled to mock her. Rifles clattered, eyes rolled. She was a shadow among warriors, nothing more. Then the alarm screamed. Explosions split the air. Smoke clawed skyward, and chaos ripped through the camp. Soldiers stumbled until she moved. With one motion, she seized the fallen rifle, dropped to a knee, and unleashed a storm of fire so precise the enemy collapsed in seconds. Silence. Every jaw hung open. The woman they scorned had become their shield. Some legends don't announce themselves. They erupt. But who exactly is she? And why did she hide in plain sight? This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The desert afternoon boiled with heat and gunfire. At Camp Resolute, the air was alive with the staccato chatter of rifles, the concussive thumps of mortars, and the acrid tang of cordite curling through the atmosphere. Sand whipped into every crevice, stinging eyes and scouring skin. It was a day carved from fire and dust, and in the middle of it stood Elena Ward, labeled by her captain as nothing more than a clerk, a paper shuffler, the person who typed up reports no one read twice. Captain Damien Cross towered over her, his frame filling the narrow space behind a shattered barricade. His face was flushed crimson with fury and strain, sweat cutting sharp lines through the dirt on his skin. He gripped his malfunctioning M4 as though it personally betrayed him and, with a cruel grin, hurled it into Elena's chest. "Here, make yourself useful," he barked, his tone dripping with scorn. "Try not to shoot your own boots." The impact rattled her ribs, but her hands closed around the weapon instinctively. Private Mason Lee, crouched nearby with a face still too young for the horrors around him, gawked at the exchange. To him, she had always been the quiet one who kept to her desk, dutiful, invisible, never part of the fight. Seeing her cradle the rifle, however, struck him with a sudden, inexplicable unease. Elena said nothing. She let the chaos roar around her, the rockets screaming into sandbags, the machine gun, fire rattling across the perimeter, men cursing as debris cascaded over their helmets. She focused not on the insults but on the steel in her grip, on the weight she knew too well. Cross sneered, leaning close enough that his spit flecked her cheek. "Let's see if the secretary remembers which way the barrel points." Then he turned back toward the sandstorm of battle, convinced he'd humiliated her. But Mason's eyes caught something that made his stomach knot. Elena's demeanor shifted, her posture straightened, her breathing steadied. The tremor of a desk worker facing live fire was absent. Instead, there was precision in her movements, a calmness so sharp it felt dangerous. Without hesitation, she yanked the charging handle. The weapon coughed, jammed tight. Cross had been right about one thing: the gun was fouled, but what he hadn't counted on was her response. Her fingers worked with mechanical speed, breaking the weapon down in practiced motions. Bolt, carrier, magazine. Each part flowed through her hands as though she'd rehearsed the sequence 1,000 times before. Mason's jaw slackened as she cleared the blockage, slammed the pieces back together, and seated the magazine with a firm slap. It took her seconds. Seconds, while outside the walls the enemy pressed harder, their cries echoing over the ridge. Mason opened his mouth, but the thunder of an explosion drowned his words. A rocket-propelled grenade slammed into a guard tower, sending wood and steel fragments showering across the compound. Men screamed, scrambling for cover, as the dust thickened into choking clouds. Cross swore and shouted into his radio, his voice a mix of rage and desperation. "Hold the line! Keep your sectors tight! Where the hell is our support?" The radio spat static. "No reinforcements yet." Elena ducked lower, her eyes narrowing, not at Cross's orders, but at the rhythm of the fight itself. Amid the cacophony, she discerned a sound that others dismissed as background noise, the hollow crack of a rifle firing from distance. Not the random shots of fighters rushing the walls, but a deliberate cadence, a marksman. She tilted her head, calculating with ears more than eyes. Mason beside her was pale as chalk. He noticed her lips moving, a whisper too faint to catch. He leaned closer and heard it. 620. Northeast rise. He froze. What? Her gaze remained fixed beyond the wire, past the smoke, to where the land rippled upward. Sniper behind those rocks. They'll chew up second squad if they don't shift position. The young private blinked, torn between disbelief and instinct. How could you possibly tell the captain? She cut in, her voice even, steady, as though the chaos couldn't touch her. Move them 20 meters south, now. Mason hesitated only a heartbeat before bolting toward Cross, who was still roaring into his handset. He relayed her warning, his voice cracking with urgency. Cross glared at him as though he'd sprouted horns. You taking orders from her now, from a file clerk? Get back to your sector, Private! He shoved Mason away. Elena's prediction proved itself before anyone could argue further. A shot rang out, the same hollow crack, and a soldier from second squad crumpled, clutching his side. The rest of the unit scattered, panicked. Cross's head whipped toward the ridge, his face paling as realization hit. Mason spun back toward Elena. Her eyes met his through the haze of grit and smoke. She hadn't moved, hadn't flinched, just studied the battlefield as though it were a puzzle only she could solve. The young man felt something shift inside him. This wasn't luck. This wasn't guessing. She knew. Cross, still too stubborn to admit it, barked louder, trying to cover his unease. "Medic to Tower 2! Keep firing! Don't let them through!" Elena finally spoke again, but not to Cross. Her words reached Mason with chilling clarity. "They'll come harder now. They think they smell blood." Another explosion rocked the compound, this one closer, scattering sandbags and rattling teeth. Elena crouched, scanning the breach. Dust hung like a curtain, obscuring everything beyond a few yards. But in her mind, the lines of the fight were already clear. Mason pressed against the wall beside her, trembling. He had never seen combat before today, and fear had him in its claws. He risked a glance at her. She wasn't trembling, not even close. Her hands, though still dusty from the rifle, were relaxed, poised. Her gaze cut through the smoke with the certainty of someone who had stood on fields like this far too many times. It unsettled him more than the enemy outside. Cross stomped past them again, his voice raw with frustration. "Ward! Where are those extra magazines I ordered you to fetch? Get moving!" She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she rose into a crouch, adjusted the strap of the rifle, now secure, against her chest, and gave Mason a look that said more than words. Then she slipped away toward the supply bunker, weaving through the storm of shrapnel and debris. Mason watched her go, torn between confusion and awe. She wasn't sprinting in blind panic like the others. She moved deliberately, ducking at the right moments, using wreckage as cover, each step chosen with care. Cross muttered something under his breath, but Mason caught none of it. His attention remained fixed on her disappearing figure. Inside the bunker, Elena moved with purpose. The dim interior offered momentary relief from the sun and smoke, but the smell of gun oil and metal was sharp. She stripped magazines from crates, sliding them into her vest in an order. That made sense only to someone trained for efficiency under fire. Ammunition by type, pouches assigned for speed. Each motion deliberate, unhurried, but rapid enough to betray years of repetition. On a shelf above, she reached for a combat tourniquet. Her fingers lingered for an instant, remembering the cold nylon strap, the windlass design, equipment not every soldier carried, but one she'd kept close regardless of her supposed role. She added it to her gear, the weight of familiar comfort. Outside, voices shouted, the pitch rising with panic. Elena inhaled, steadying herself, then returned to the chaos. When she emerged, the scene had worsened. The outer barricade sagged in places where mortars had torn holes. Fighters surged through, shadows against the bright sky, their cries shrill and urgent. Gunfire erupted from every angle. Cross, red-faced and furious, spotted her. "What the hell are you doing with 2 rifles on your back? You think this is some kind of game?" Before she could reply, another rocket slammed into the communications antenna, showering sparks across the compound. The blast drowned his tirade. Elena felt it then, a rhythm within the chaos, a pattern that didn't belong to chance. She pivoted, scanning the ridges beyond the wire. Among the shifting figures, she sensed direction, an unseen hand guiding them. There was someone out there, orchestrating the assault with precision. Her lips curved into the faintest of grim smiles, unseen by anyone. The battle was far from over, and the game they thought they were playing had only begun. Elena Ward stepped back into the light with her vest heavy from fresh ammunition, her eyes already scanning for paths through collapsing defenses. The ground trembled as more mortars slammed into the outer walls, flinging dirt and jagged stone into the air. Camp Resolute was being shaken apart piece by piece, and the defenders were scattering in confusion. Private Mason Lee spotted her return and exhaled with relief. He had expected her to stumble under the load, to fumble under pressure like anyone else unaccustomed to frontline battle. Instead, she slid into position behind a fractured concrete slab, movements economical, her focus unbroken. Something about her still unsettled him. A shriek overhead drew every head upward. An incoming round arced down and exploded just beyond the wire, rattling eardrums. Men threw themselves to the ground. One screamed, clutching a leg torn open by shrapnel. Cross's voice thundered across the din. Furious orders barked with desperation more than command. "Hold your fire steady! Keep the bastards outside!" Elena crouched low, adjusting her grip on the rifle she had just rebuilt minutes earlier. Her ears picked up a faint, distinct crack, sharper than the rest of the firefight. It came in pairs, measured, deliberate. She angled her head, filtering through the cacophony. That was no random exchange. It was the work of a hidden shooter working at distance. She leaned closer to Mason, her words quiet but clear. "They've got a marksman positioned along the northeast rise, about 600 out. He's controlling their pressure points." Mason blinked rapidly. "You can tell that just from sound?" "Tell the captain," she instructed, never lifting her gaze from the horizon. "Shift second squad. If they stay where they are, they'll get torn up." The young private hesitated, torn between awe and disbelief, then bolted through the smoke toward Cross. The captain, already seething from setbacks, rounded on him with a glare. "What now?" Mason stammered out the warning. Cross's jaw tightened. He waved it away with contempt. "We don't take tactical advice from a typist. Get back in line!" The rebuff stung, but Mason obeyed. Before he could return, another rifle shot cracked, and a soldier near the ridge dropped instantly, blood soaking his sleeve. The reality of Elena's warning hit with brutal clarity. Cross cursed under his breath, shouting for a medic, his composure fraying further. From her position, Elena studied the smoke-streaked horizon. The attack wasn't chaotic, it was being choreographed. Whoever led the assault knew how to exploit weakness, pressing hard at vulnerable points. Her mind tracked the rhythm. Bursts of fire here, a probing push there, feints that forced defenders to spread thin. It was all too precise. Mason slid back beside her, shaken by what had just unfolded. He didn't need to say it. His wide eyes told her he knew she had been right. She kept her attention outward, refusing to acknowledge vindication. The battle demanded focus, not pride. Another barrage thundered against the walls, one explosion close enough to rock her back on her heels. Screams echoed as debris rained down. Dust thickened, turning the afternoon sky into a grey veil. Through it, advancing silhouettes surged toward the breach. Cross tried to rally them, roaring commands drowned out by chaos. His once imposing figure now looked strained, his movements jerky, his voice rasping with frustration. Men still obeyed him, but hesitantly, their faith shaken. Elena pulled Mason behind cover as bullets sparked against their barricade. His breathing came in ragged gasps, his rifle trembling in his hands. How can you stay so calm?" he whispered. She answered without looking at him. "Panic kills faster than bullets. Breathe steady. Keep your weapon close." Another shadow of movement drew her gaze. On the eastern edge, fighters poured forward in a coordinated push. Their chants rose louder, footsteps pounding as they swarmed through the gap blasted open moments earlier. The defenders braced for impact. Cross spotted Elena again, fury written across his features. He stormed toward her, gesturing violently. "Ward, I told you to fetch magazines, not play soldier." "Who gave you authority to haul rifles? Drop them before you hurt yourself." His words cut through the clash like a sneer. Mason winced, expecting her to shrink, but she didn't. She met Cross's glare with quiet resolve, her silence heavier than any retort. Cross stepped closer, nearly spitting with rage. "You think this is a game? These men are fighting for their lives, and you—" The rest of his tirade drowned as a rocket screamed overhead and slammed into a storage hut, tearing the roof apart in a spray of fire and splinters. Soldiers scattered, ducking low. Amid the smoke and fire, Elena sank into cover and checked her rifle again. Mason stared at her hands, noting the way she moved, not frantic, but precise, practiced. He realized then that the captain's insults no longer matched what he was seeing. She wasn't guessing her way through chaos. She was navigating it like someone who belonged. A sudden crash on the northern wall sent vibrations through the earth. More enemy fighters breached, rushing forward with a surge of gunfire. The defenders reeled, disorganized. Cross shouted desperately, trying to control the tide, his authority unraveling by the second. Amid the storm, Elena rose into a crouch, peering through the haze. Her gaze locked on movement at the edge of vision. Fighters weren't charging blindly. They were being directed by someone skilled. It confirmed her suspicion. An unseen commander orchestrated this attack with methodical intent. She pressed a fresh magazine into her rifle, the metallic click steadying her. Then she leaned close to Mason, speaking low, so only he could hear. "If we don't cut off the head of this push, the whole camp collapses." He swallowed hard. "You mean the one giving orders?" Her eyes flicked toward the smoke-veiled ridge. "Yes, and I've already got an idea where." The next blast forced them both flat, fragments pelting their helmets. Elena shielded her face with her arm, then rolled back into position, dust streaking her skin. She adjusted the strap of her vest, every detail in place. Mason dared a glance at her expression. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even tension. It was calculation. She was already preparing for something none of them had considered possible. Cross stomped past again, yelling into his handset, his fury barely concealing the cracks in his composure. His men fired blindly, wasting ammunition. And all the while the enemy pressed closer, their morale intact, their leader unscathed. Elena steadied her breathing. She had seen enough fights to know the pattern. Unless someone broke it, the enemy momentum would keep building until nothing was left to defend. She flexed her shoulder once, testing the rifle's weight. Mason caught the subtle motion and realized she was readying herself for more than just survival. The private opened his mouth to ask, but the words never left. Another distinct rifle crack echoed from the ridge. Both of them ducked as a soldier to their left toppled sideways, lifeless. The sound was unmistakable, the distant marksman striking again. Mason's heart pounded. He looked to Elena. She was already shifting position, eyes narrowing, mind working through invisible angles. Cross bellowed another command, but even his voice was losing dominance. Soldiers glanced at Elena instead, drawn to her composure amid the storm. She leaned the rifle across the broken barrier, eyes fixed on the smoke-blurred rise. Her breathing slowed. Mason felt the hairs on his neck stand up. Something about the way she centered herself made the battlefield seem suddenly smaller, as if all the chaos funneled toward that single ridgeline. And in that moment, Mason understood, whether Cross admitted it or not, their survival hinged not on shouted orders or frantic gestures, but on the silent determination of the woman everyone had underestimated. The storm of fire around them built higher, the pressure closing in, yet Elena's presence remained steady, a stillness at the center of a raging sea. And as another mortar ripped into the wire, tearing a fresh hole, she whispered, just loud enough for Mason to hear, "This is where the real fight begins." The battlefield roared like a furnace. The outer wire sagged under relentless pressure, fighters surging through gaps with cries that echoed off the desert ridge. Smoke boiled upward, mixing with dust, until the sun itself seemed smothered. Amid the chaos, Elena Ward moved with a clarity that jarred against the madness around her. She crouched beside a sandbag wall, already fraying at the edges, her hands quick as she loaded magazines into pouches with deliberate order. Where others fumbled under stress, she seemed to find rhythm, a tempo suited to the firestorm. Mason Lee, still clutching his weapon with white knuckles, caught glimpses of her actions and felt a strange reassurance despite the mayhem. Cross's voice boomed again, hoarse from overuse, but his commands carried less weight now. Soldiers glanced his way out of duty, then back at Elena as though instinctively, aware that her silence held more sense than his shouted rage. The next blast hammered the compound's interior, throwing men off their feet. Shards of metal tore through tarps and supplies, scattering papers, rations, anything not nailed down. Elena rolled behind cover, shielding her head, then rose smoothly, eyes narrowed. She did not waste time scanning for approval. She assessed lines of fire, movement, and the growing breach. Mason dragged himself beside her, coughing through the dust. "We can't hold them," he gasped, panic creeping into every syllable. She answered evenly, not taking her gaze off the smoke-choked entry point. "We can, but not like this." Cross stormed past again, kicking debris aside, and jabbed a finger at her. "Ward, you're supposed to be moving supplies, not pretending you're some kind of warrior. Drop that rifle and get to the rear." The men nearby exchanged uneasy looks. Some tightened grips on their weapons, others ducked their heads, unwilling to challenge him. Elena kept her composure, her face unreadable. Inside, though, she weighed her choices carefully. She had buried this side of herself for years, lived under a mask of routine and anonymity. But the battlefield was tearing that disguise away. Each action, each instinct she followed without hesitation risked exposing truths she had vowed never to reveal. Mason glanced between them, torn. The captain's authority was failing, but defying him outright still carried danger. Yet Mason's gut told him Elena saw more than any of them, understood what none of them could. The pounding outside escalated. A section of the wall finally collapsed, sending a plume of grit skyward. Fighters stormed through with rifles raised, forcing the defenders back into tighter quarters. Bullets ricocheted off shattered concrete. Elena reacted instantly. She pulled Mason down, leveled her weapon, and delivered precise bursts that cut into the advancing line. Her shots weren't frantic. They were disciplined, economical. Every squeeze measured, every round counted. 2 attackers dropped, another stumbled back. Mason stared in disbelief. He had fired 3 times as many rounds and barely suppressed his own shaking. She, on the other hand, fired as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Cross saw it too, though his pride masked any acknowledgement. His mouth twisted in disdain, even as he watched her bullets stem the surge. "Lucky shots," he barked, though the words carried little conviction. Elena ignored him. She shifted to another firing position, sliding along the debris with uncanny efficiency. Her movements carried no wasted effort. A soldier nearby, blood streaking his cheek, blinked as she passed. "Who the hell is she?" he muttered, though no one answered. As the attackers regrouped, Elena crouched to reload. Mason dropped beside her, his breathing ragged. He wanted to ask, needed to ask, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, he whispered, "Where did you learn to fight like that?" She paused, the faintest shadow crossing her features. "Long time ago," she said simply, before snapping the next magazine into place. But Mason wasn't satisfied. He had noticed details others overlooked, the way she had handled the jammed rifle earlier with surgical precision. The way she listened for sound cues that no one else even registered. The confidence in her aim, as though distance and wind were second nature. Pieces of a puzzle fell together in his mind, but the picture was too outrageous to accept. Another wave surged against them, shrieking, firing wildly. Mason flinched as bullets cracked overhead. Elena, by contrast, leaned into the fight, bracing her rifle against rubble, delivering bursts that carved breathing room for the defenders. It was then Mason noticed something he hadn't before. As she shifted position, her sleeve hitched up, revealing part of her shoulder. For a moment he caught sight of roughened skin, a circular scar etched deep, radiating lines like a sunburst. He knew enough about rifles to recognize it. That mark wasn't from accident. It came from years of recoil hammering the same spot, thousands of hours spent behind a scope. His throat tightened. This wasn't some fluke, some desk sergeant who had gotten lucky under pressure. She was something else entirely. The enemy pressed harder, forcing the defenders back toward the command hut. Cross yelled for reinforcements that weren't coming, his voice cracking. Elena pressed forward, covering angles others missed. Her presence kept the line from collapsing, though none of the soldiers dared voice it aloud. Mason's mind churned. He had been taught to follow rank, to respect the chain of command. But here, under fire, he saw the truth plain as day. The captain's authority was words. Elena's presence was survival. The storm of bullets paused for a heartbeat as the fighters outside regrouped. Smoke hung heavy, filling lungs with every breath. Elena shifted her stance, scanning the ridges again, her mind calculating. She had spotted patterns in the chaos, maneuvers too deliberate to be random. Somewhere out there, a commander was pulling strings. She adjusted her rifle, her jaw tightening. She didn't want this role again, hadn't sought it, yet every instinct pulled her back into it. Her old life, the one she thought she'd buried beneath stacks of reports and typed memos, was clawing its way to the surface. Mason finally spoke, voice low, urgent. "That scar on your shoulder, that's not from office work." Elena didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained on the horizon, lips pressed thin. Finally, she said, "Keep your eyes open, Private. This isn't the time for questions." But Mason knew. Even if he couldn't put a name to it, he knew. The woman beside him wasn't who she pretended to be. And though the revelation unsettled him, it also filled him with a surge of hope. Because if she had once been the kind of fighter he suspected, maybe they had a chance after all. Another roar split the air as mortars detonated against the inner wall, shaking the ground beneath their boots. Cross screamed for them to fall back, his voice ragged, his composure shredded. Soldiers scrambled, dragging wounded, coughing through smoke. Amid the retreat, Elena planted herself firm, her rifle braced, eyes cold as she scanned the ridge. Mason saw it then, not just discipline, but the weight of memory pressing down. Her past wasn't dead. It was alive in every movement, every choice. She squeezed the trigger again, bullets cutting a swath that forced the enemy to duck. She moved forward a step, refusing to give ground easily. The men around her followed without realizing, their retreat slowed, their panic tempered by her example. Cross barked at them, furious, but they looked to Elena instead. Mason leaned against the barricade, heart pounding, and whispered the truth. Aloud, though no one heard him over the thunder. "She's not just a clerk. She's something else. Something dangerous." And in that moment, the tide of perception inside Camp Resolute began to shift. Not because of shouted orders, but because of one woman's refusal to break. The mask she had worn for so long was slipping, and every soldier near her could sense it, even if they couldn't name it yet. The compound was unraveling. What had been a tenuous defense minutes ago now felt like a collapsing dam. Fighters rushed through gaps in the perimeter, their war cries tearing at nerves already stretched to the breaking point. Smoke curled in heavy curtains, blotting out the sky, and the crackle of gunfire rattled every surface. Captain Damien Cross stomped through the chaos, his chest heaving with rage more than exertion. His pride was bleeding out with every casualty. Men faltered at his orders, their eyes drifting toward the quiet figure of Elena Ward instead. That unspoken betrayal burned hotter than the sun overhead. He found her crouched near a shattered barricade, steadying a wounded soldier's arm while bracing her rifle across her knee. Even under fire, she moved with methodical calm, and that, her composure in the midst of collapse, infuriated him. Cross strode over, grabbed the strap of the weapon, and yanked hard enough to jar her shoulder. "You want to play soldier? Then take mine," he snarled. From his back he ripped free his own carbine, the one he had cursed for days. "It's been nothing but trouble, just like you." He shoved it into her chest with a sneer. Elena accepted the rifle without protest. The weight was familiar, but the action refused to cycle smoothly. She could feel the resistance immediately. Cross leaned in, his voice sharp and cruel. "Try not to blow your fingers off, princess." The insult rang out louder than the gunfire nearby, and several men glanced their way. Mason Lee, crouched a few feet away, froze. He saw the disdain in the captain's eyes and the faint flicker of something else, fear disguised as arrogance. Elena lowered her gaze briefly to the weapon. The chamber was fouled, brass wedged where it shouldn't be. To most, it was useless under fire. To her, it was another problem to solve. Her hands worked quickly, breaking down the rifle with practiced ease. Metal clinked softly against her gloves as she stripped out the jammed casing, inspected the feed ramps, and reassembled in a blur of motion. Mason watched, transfixed, as though time slowed around her. Cross barked a laugh, but the sound faltered when he realized she had finished. The weapon was back together and functional in less time than it took him to finish scoffing. His smirk slipped, replaced by a flush of anger. Elena pulled the charging handle, chambered around, and slid into firing position before he could stop her. Her movements weren't flashy, they were efficient, an economy of motion that spoke of endless repetition. Nearby soldiers paused mid-reload, staring. The clerk they had dismissed for months had just done in seconds what some of them struggled with during training. Cross tried to reclaim ground with volume. Waste of ammunition. Put that thing down before you give away our position. But his words lacked bite. He sounded less like a commander and more like a man desperate to keep control slipping through his fingers. Elena ignored him. She braced against the rubble, eyes locked on the breach where enemy fighters poured in. Her cheek pressed against the worn stock, breath slowing to a rhythm that seemed alien amidst the chaos. Mason edged closer, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could see the shift in her, no longer the silent staffer who kept to shadows, but a force commanding gravity itself. The enemy pressed forward, confident, their formation tight. Elena squeezed the trigger once. The report cracked through the air, sharp and decisive. One fighter dropped instantly, his advance cut short mid-stride. Another burst, 2 rounds this time, found their mark. The line faltered. Confusion rippled outward as more of their number stumbled. Gasps escaped from the men around her. Soldiers who moments before had doubted her now found their eyes fixed on her steadiness. Cross swallowed hard, his jaw tight. "Lucky," he muttered, but even he didn't believe it. Elena shifted slightly, her weapon steady, movements calculated. Each shot broke the rhythm of the attack, chipping away at their momentum. She wasn't spraying bullets wildly, she was cutting surgically, dismantling the wave one fragment at a time. Mason gripped his rifle tighter, emboldened. He lined up alongside her, mimicking her breathing, her focus. For the first time since the assault began, his fear loosened its grip. The enemy regrouped quickly, surging again with renewed fury. Their commander's voice carried faintly from the ridge, barking instructions that kept them cohesive. Elena's eyes flicked upward. She knew exactly what that meant. The figure directing them was still alive, still orchestrating the fight with cold precision. She murmured under her breath, almost inaudible, "We need to silence him." Cross caught it, his temper flaring. "You think you know better than me? You're a damn clerk." He grabbed her shoulder roughly, trying to pull her away from the barrier. "You'll get us all killed with your—" She spun, eyes hard, voice cutting sharper than his bark. "Either fight or step aside. People are dying." The command in her tone stunned him into silence. For the first time he recoiled, not from defiance, but from the force of authority he hadn't expected from her. Mason stared, wide-eyed. He had never heard her speak with such fire. The nearby soldiers heard it too, and in that instant it was her words that anchored them, not Cross's. Another explosion rattled the ground, showering them with grit. Elena dropped back into position, adjusting for a fresh angle. Her jaw set, she fired again, and another attacker spun to the ground. Her vest shifted as she moved, and Mason caught sight of that scar again, the Circular mark etched deep into her skin, radiating outward like a star. His suspicions solidified into certainty. No ordinary staff sergeant carried a mark like that. It belonged to a sharpshooter who had lived behind a rifle long enough for the steel to carve memory into flesh. The soldiers closest to her no longer questioned. They simply followed her rhythm, firing when she did, bracing when she shifted. The tide of doubt had turned, quietly but unmistakably. Cross stood frozen, caught between rage and reluctant recognition. His authority was bleeding out faster than the defender's ammunition. Elena's rifle barked again, and a fighter collapsed near the breach, his weapon clattering uselessly to the dirt. She adjusted seamlessly, scanning for the next threat. Mason leaned close, voice low, reverent. "You're not who you say you are." Her eyes didn't leave the battlefield. "Keep your head down, Private." The pressure outside mounted, waves of attackers driving harder, their confidence fed by the unseen commander's orders. But inside Camp Resolute, a different confidence was taking root. Born, not of shouted commands, but of one woman's refusal to yield. And for the first time since the onslaught began, hope flickered, not because the captain demanded it, but because Elena Ward had seized it from the jaws of collapse. The battlefield hadn't shifted yet, but the balance of respect inside those walls had, and Cross, though unwilling to admit it aloud, felt it most of all. The roar of battle dulled for an instant, replaced by ringing in Mason Lee's ears. He had seen it clearly, etched into her skin when the edge of her vest shifted. That scar wasn't random damage. It was the signature of someone molded by recoil, countless hours of marksmanship, grinding the mark into bone and muscle. He swallowed hard, blinking through grit. Around them, defenders scrambled to reload, dragging wounded comrades to cover, shouting to one another over the thunder outside. Yet Mason's focus clung to Elena. Her rifle tracked the breach with deadly steadiness, eyes narrowed on shapes moving in the haze. She looked less like the woman who once typed reports in silence, and more like a predator waiting for the exact moment to strike. Another volley shook the ground. Stones and shrapnel pattered down from the ruined wall. Men flinched, ducked, cursed. Elena didn't move. She shifted only enough to adjust her angle, slipping the stock into the same scarred groove on her shoulder. Mason felt his pulse hammering. He wanted to say something, to name what he now understood, but the words caught in his throat. If he spoke it aloud, it would make it real. Cross stalked nearby, sweat streaking his face, shouting half-formed orders. His voice cracked, his composure faltering, but still he tried to command. Soldiers obeyed out of habit, but their eyes drifted, always drifting, back to the woman crouched at the barrier. The next surge of fighters poured forward, screaming, rifles flashing. Elena exhaled, squeezed the trigger. A burst dropped one, then another. Each shot struck like punctuation in the chaos. Mason mirrored her breathing unconsciously, lining up his sights. For the first time since the fight began, he felt control, however fleeting. One of the older sergeants, crouched 2 positions over, muttered under his breath after watching her precision. "That's no admin." The comments spread like wildfire through the squad. No one said more, but every man who heard it thought the same. Elena adjusted her position, sliding along the shattered wall to cover another angle. As she moved, the scar came into view again, clear this time, no mistaking it. Mason wasn't the only one who noticed. The older sergeant caught sight of it, his mouth tightening. He didn't ask, he didn't need to. He'd seen it before, years back, on men who lived behind scopes, ghosts of the battlefield who carried reputations more legend than fact. Elena settled into place, unfazed by the shifting perceptions around her. She had lived too long trying to disappear, but here, under fire, her concealment frayed. Every movement exposed another piece of who she really was. Cross stormed closer, voice booming. "What? I said pull back! You're not qualified to." A shot cracked from the ridge, forcing him to duck as a chunk of concrete exploded inches from his head. He swore, face pale, then glared at her as if she had summoned the bullet herself. Elena's reply was flat, cold, and carried more authority than his shouting. "Stay low, Captain! You're silhouetting yourself!" The men nearby exchanged glances. None of them had dared correct him before. The silence that followed was heavier than the barrage outside. Mason felt a jolt in his chest. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't cursed, but her tone carried command, the kind that came from years of leading through fire. The enemy pressed harder, waves crashing against their thinning line. Elena's gaze locked on the distant rise again. Through smoke and flickering muzzle flashes she saw them, fighters moving with unnatural coordination, guided by unseen signals, and at the heart of it she could almost sense the commander, the one orchestrating every step. She fired again, calm, controlled, her focus unbroken. Each trigger pull whispered what she would not say aloud. She was not what they believed. Mason leaned closer, voice barely audible. "That scar, it's from a rifle, isn't it? You're not who you pretend to be." Her jaw tightened. She didn't look at him. "Keep your eyes on the fight, Lee." He wanted to press, but another explosion rocked them, silencing further questions. The defenders huddled tighter, ammunition dwindling. Fear gnawed at their edges. Yet every time Elena fired, every time she shifted smoothly into another position, the men steadied. Her presence became a rallying point, even if none of them spoke it aloud. Cross saw it too. It twisted his gut, the sight of his soldiers drawing confidence from her instead of him. His glare could have burned through stone, but his fury held no weight. He had lost them without realizing it. Another push slammed against the line. Elena braced, eyes flat, movements exact. Her rifle bucked against the scarred groove of her shoulder, shot after shot, tearing gaps in the enemy surge. Mason fired alongside her, emboldened, his fear tempered by imitation. For a moment the tide slowed. Fighters fell back, dragging wounded, regrouping. The lulls stretched, smoke rolling in waves. Elena lowered her weapon slightly, scanning the ridge with unblinking eyes. She knew what came next. They weren't retreating, they were recalculating. The mind directing them was far from finished. She wiped grit from her cheek with the back of her glove, then checked her gear again, motions crisp, practiced. Mason studied her silently, the puzzle of who she was nearly complete. Only one piece remained, a name. The older sergeant whispered again, this time just loud enough for Mason to hear. "I've seen a scar like that once before." Belonged to a sniper in Delta. His eyes flicked to Elena. They called her Ghost. Mason's blood ran cold. Ghost. He had heard the name in rumors passed between units, a figure half legend, half warning. A sniper who had done the impossible and vanished without a trace. Soldiers told stories in hushed tones of shots taken at distances others wouldn't. A dream of missions that should have ended in annihilation but didn't. And always Ghost disappeared afterward, as if she were never there. His gaze locked on Elena, the woman who had typed his reports, who had quietly handed out duty rosters. And suddenly every quiet habit, the way she tossed sand into the wind, the way she handled weapons like extensions of her own body, clicked into place. She was Ghost. The realization hit him harder than any explosion. Another mortar screamed in, detonating inside the compound. The shockwave rattled teeth, knocked soldiers sprawling. Smoke swallowed everything. Through the haze, Elena rose again, weapon ready, her silhouette steady against the inferno. Mason could barely breathe. He wasn't sure if it was the dust choking his lungs or the weight of what he had just uncovered. Around them, men scrambled to regroup. Cross shouted uselessly, and the enemy prepared for another wave. But Mason knew everything had changed. The secret that had lingered like a shadow was now illuminated, at least to him, and perhaps to a few others. Elena Ward, the so-called staff sergeant, was no mere clerk. She was the ghost every soldier whispered about in the dark. And if that was true, then maybe, just maybe, they weren't finished yet. The next surge built outside. The sound of boots pounding the earth, voices rising in unison. Elena braced herself, her eyes narrowing, the scar visible again under the shifting vest strap. Mason gripped his rifle tighter, heart hammering, as he realized he was about to fight beside a legend. The lull broke with renewed ferocity. From beyond the shattered wire came the thunder of boots, a disciplined rhythm beneath the scattered shouts. Smoke rolled across the camp like a tide, curling through gaps, masking movements until shapes materialized only at the last moment. Gunfire sparked off twisted steel, carving flashes into the haze. Elena Ward steadied herself against the broken wall, scanning the horizon. Her breathing slowed until the chaos dulled at the edges. Somewhere out there, a single voice was controlling the madness. She had followed enough battles to recognize a hand guiding troops into synchronized waves. Every push came at just the right moment, every feint timed to drag the defenders thin. The enemy commander wasn't just shouting orders, he was orchestrating a symphony of violence. Mason Lee crouched close, chest rising and falling in ragged bursts. He had seen the scar, heard the whispers, and now clung to one impossible thought. If she truly was who he suspected, then maybe there was still a chance. Another crack split the noise. A defender toppled with a cry, blood soaking his sleeve. Mason jerked at the sound, recognizing it now. The distant rifle with its cruel, deliberate cadence. The sniper on the ridge hadn't left. He was the eyes of the commander, punishing any mistake. Elena tracked the sound, her mind running calculations. Elevation, distance, wind dragging sideways through the smoke. The barrel in her hands wasn't meant for this kind of reach, not with its bent sight post and fouled grooves. But she had done worse with less. Cross stumbled up beside them, his face blotched with fury. "Ward! Put that damn thing down before you get us all killed." "You're not here to—" She cut him off without looking at him, voice low but edged with steel. "Captain, either cover my flank or stay silent." The weight of her tone froze him. Mason saw the struggle in his features, the need to assert control, battling the realization that control had already shifted. Cross backed a half-step, anger simmering but words gone. Elena slid flat against the ground, easing into a prone position. She laid the rifle across her pack, using it as an improvised rest. Her cheek found the stock, nestling into the scarred groove worn into her shoulder over years of recoil. The compound blurred around her until only the ridge existed. Through gaps in the smoke she spotted him, a figure elevated above his men, flanked by bodyguards, his posture confident. A commander, gesturing with quick precision, antenna jutting from the radio on his back. Even at this distance, she could see the authority in his stance. He believed himself untouchable. Mason followed her gaze and shook his head. "That's insane. You can't even see him clearly." "I see enough," she murmured. She thumbed the magazine, checked the chamber, every part of her body aligned with the shot. She whispered corrections under her breath, adjustments only she could hear. "Crosswind. pushing left, barrel fouling, altering spin, heat shimmer distorting the path. Her world narrowed to one heartbeat, one squeeze away. The trigger gave beneath her finger. The rifle barked. For a split second, silence seemed to follow the shot across the distance. Then, through the drifting haze, the commander's body jerked backward. The round struck high, bursting into a mist that stunned those around him. The bullet continued into the radio on his back, shattering it into useless fragments. The bodyguards froze, disbelief painted across their movements. Soldiers nearby faltered, voices rising in sudden panic. Without their leader, without his voice in their ear, cohesion evaporated. Inside Camp Resolute, time itself held still. Every defender who saw it understood what had happened. Mason's eyes went wide, his mouth open but voiceless. Cross lifted his binoculars with trembling hands, desperate to confirm. Through magnified lenses he saw the truth, the man who had held their camp in. A noose lay sprawled in the dust, his command shattered along with his radio. "What the hell?" Cross whispered, his voice hollow. The effect was immediate. Enemy fighters who had moments before pressed forward with ruthless unity now wavered. Their rhythm collapsed into disarray, each man shouting without direction, retreating to cover, firing wildly without purpose. The assault that had threatened to crush them dissolved like smoke in the wind. Elena cycled the bolt, chambered another round, and adjusted without missing a beat. She moved with mechanical precision, scanning for secondary threats. Mason stared at her, awe etched deep in his features. The defenders erupted in disbelief. Some cheered, others simply gawked, but all felt the shift. Hope surged where despair had nearly swallowed them whole. Cross lowered the binoculars slowly, his pride bleeding out of him. He turned to her, lips parted as though words might come, but nothing did. He had mocked her, humiliated her, called her dead weight, and she had just saved them all with a single impossible shot. Elena stayed silent, her focus unbroken. She shifted to engage fighters who were still lingering too close to the breach, firing in steady pairs. Each round struck with clinical accuracy, trimming away the last of the organized push. Mason leaned close, voice hushed, reverent. "You didn't just kill him. You cut their head off the whole attack." Her eyes stayed locked on her sights. That was the point. The compound trembled again, but this time from within, the energy of men realizing they might survive. Soldiers who had been seconds from collapse pushed forward with renewed strength. They dragged barricades into place, reinforced weak points, shouted to one another with vigor. Elena kept working, her weapon bucking against her shoulder, scar pressed deeper by every shot. Mason realized she wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smiling. Her expression was cold, detached, as though the victory cost her something invisible. Cross finally found his voice, though it cracked. "Nobody makes that shot. Not with that rifle. Not at that distance." He stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. "Who are you?" Elena didn't answer. She shifted her position, eyes still on the ridge, searching for confirmation that the enemy leader stayed down. The battle waned, fighters retreating in disorder, their chants dissolved into shouts of panic. Some tried to drag their commander's body, others fled outright. What had been a coordinated storm turned into a fractured retreat. And still, Elena watched, her finger poised on the trigger, unwilling to relent until the last of them disappeared over the rise. Only then did she lower the rifle, exhaling slowly. The compound was filled with the groans of the wounded, the clatter of gear, the barked orders of sergeants rallying what remained. But over it all hung the stunned silence of men who had just witnessed the impossible. Mason finally spoke, his voice trembling with awe. They'll tell stories about this, about you. She looked at him briefly, her eyes shadowed. Stories don't matter. Survival does. Cross stumbled back, still staring at her. He wanted to lash out, to reassert himself, but the words died in his throat. His men would never see him the same. The center of gravity had shifted irrevocably, and it now rested with Elena Ward. The battle wasn't finished. Wounded still cried out. Engineers scrambled to patch defenses, but the tide had turned, and at the center of it, lying prone with a battered rifle across her pack, was the woman they had all underestimated. Mason thought back to the whispers he'd heard from the older sergeant, the name carried like rumor across units. Ghost. He looked at her now and knew with certainty. The legend wasn't just real. She was here, and she had just walked back into the light of war. The ridge fell quiet, not the silence of peace, but the stunned hush that follows a blow no one expected. The enemy's command had been torn out, and the echoes of their retreat drifted across the desert like smoke fading into the horizon. Camp Resolute stood battered, its defenses shredded, the air still thick with dust and blood. But it stood. Elena Ward pushed herself upright, the rifle cradled against her chest. Her eyes lingered on the rise where the commander had collapsed, watching until the last figures disappeared beyond sight. Only then did she let her breath release, slow and even, as though reeling her focus back into her body. Around her, soldiers moved in disbelief. Some whispered under their breath, unable to reconcile what they had seen. Others stared openly, their expressions a mix of awe and confusion. Mason Lee remained beside her, still processing the shot that had turned the battlefield. Cross paced like a man who had lost more than a fight. His face was pale beneath grime, his voice stuck in his throat. Every glance from his men felt like a wound. Authority that once rested in his stature now slipped through his fingers, flowing instead toward the woman he had spent months belittling. Then came the sound, rotor blades chopping through the air. At first faint, then building into a roar that pressed against the chest. The defenders froze, eyes lifting skyward, not medevac birds. These machines moved differently, faster, sharper, their profiles darker against the glare of the sun. Two black helicopters swept low over the ridge, engines growling like predators. They banked hard, side doors flung open, door gunners already pouring controlled bursts into the remnants of the retreating enemy. Sand whipped into whirlwinds beneath them as they slowed, hovering with surgical precision. Elena recognized them immediately. The modifications to their rotors, the lack of identifying insignia, the fluid way they slid across the airspace. This wasn't conventional air cavalry. These were hunters. She knew the rhythm of their movements because once, not so long ago, she had moved with them. The ropes dropped before the skids even touched ground. Figures descended with terrifying speed, black-clad and faceless, their silhouettes cutting through dust like shadows given form. Weapons snapped into ready positions before boots even hit the dirt. Delta Force. The shift inside the compound was palpable. Soldiers who had been moments from despair now straightened, relief and disbelief mixing in their eyes. They had been saved, but the timing felt almost unnatural. Elena held her rifle loosely now, watching as the operators spread across the defenses, reinforcing positions with the ease of veterans who had rehearsed such movements countless times. Their presence changed the air. Where there had been chaos, there was suddenly discipline. One of them paused mid-stride, helmet tilted toward her, visor reflecting the smoke. For a long beat, he didn't move. Then he pulled off his ballistic glasses, revealing weathered features framed by streaks of grey at his temples. Elena's heart clenched. She knew that face. Master Sergeant Daniel Harker. Years had passed since she had last seen him, but recognition struck instantly. He stared at her as if seeing a ghost. "Ward?" His voice rasped through the noise. Then, softer, incredulous. "No, ghost." The word slipped out, carried more weight than any cheer. Several soldiers turned, confusion on their faces. Mason's breath caught. There it was, spoken aloud, the name she had buried under dust and paperwork. Elena's jaw tightened. She didn't answer, didn't deny it. Silence was all the confirmation Harker needed. He took a step closer, disbelief etched into every line of his face. "We held your memorial." His tone wasn't accusation, but grief resurfacing. "Your star's on the wall at Bragg." Cross's head snapped around, eyes wide. He looked from Harker to Elena, his mouth opening and closing, unable to process. Mason kept his gaze fixed on her, the puzzle complete at last. The operators around them noticed too. Their formation didn't falter, they were too professional for that. But glances flicked her way, lingering just a moment too long. Recognition traveled wordlessly through the unit. Elena forced herself to keep moving, sliding a fresh magazine into place, scanning the defenses as though nothing had changed. Inside, however, her chest tightened. She had chosen this life of obscurity, chosen to leave Ghost behind. But the battlefield had dragged her back into the light, and now there was no hiding. Harker approached until they stood almost face to face. His eyes searched hers for denial, for explanation, for anything. She gave none. Only the steadiness of someone who had carried too much for too long. He finally nodded, the smallest movement, but filled with understanding. "We thought you were gone." "I was," she said quietly, then turned her eyes back toward the horizon, unwilling to let more slip. The firefight outside dwindled. Delta operators swept through weak points, clearing stragglers with ruthless efficiency. Their discipline underlined what the defenders already knew. The fight was over for now, but inside Camp Resolute, a new tension brewed. Men whispered about what they had seen, about the impossible shot, about the name spoken by one of America's most elite. Ghost, the myth who had walked among them, disguised as a clerk. Cross tried to reassert himself, but every time he opened his mouth, eyes cut away from him to her. His words were smoke, her presence was stone. He felt it, knew it, but could do nothing. Mason stayed close to Elena, still reeling. "Why here?" he whispered, unable to stop himself. "Why hide like this?" She didn't answer. Her expression was unreadable, her silence heavier than explanation. Above them, the third helicopter approached. A larger craft bristling with antenna arrays, circling once before descending. Dust spiraled outward as its skids touched ground. Every man still standing snapped to alert, even Harker. The door slid open, and down stepped a figure whose presence commanded immediate respect. General Patricia Monroe, commander of Joint Special Operations Command, strode across the debris with a gait that carried both authority and weight of years. Her security detail fanned out seamlessly, but her eyes locked on Elena from the moment she appeared. For a heartbeat, the battlefield seemed to still again. Soldiers straightened instinctively. Cross saluted stiffly despite his trembling hand. Mason nearly forgot to breathe. The general stopped before Elena, studying her with a gaze both sharp and knowing. The silence stretched, every second louder than the last. Then Monroe spoke, her voice low but unmistakably certain. "Master Sergeant Ward, or should I say Ghost?" The title cracked open everything. Cross stumbled. Mason's eyes went wide. Whispers rippled through the men. Elena felt the name strike her chest like a hammer. The secret was no longer hers to control. She straightened unconsciously, muscle memory aligning her spine. For 3 years she had lived small, anonymous. her identity stripped to an admin role. And yet in a single breath, the mask had been shattered by someone who saw straight through it. Around them, Delta operators lingered, some stealing quick glances, others keeping their focus outward, but all knew. Their legend had returned from the grave. Elena met the general's eyes, her own expression steady though her pulse beat hard against her ribs. "Ma'am," she said simply, voice controlled. The general's lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. It seems Ghost never really died. And in that moment, the battlefield of Camp Resolute became more than just another fight. It became the stage for the return of a phantom the world thought buried. The wind kicked up dust in spirals around the landing pad as the general's boots touched the ground. Camp Resolute, fractured and reeking of cordite, seemed to fall under a different kind of silence. Not the hush of fear, but the pause that comes when history intrudes. General Patricia Monroe stood inches shorter than some of the operators flanking her, but she carried herself with such gravity that even the battered soldiers straightened without command. Her uniform was immaculate despite the dust, her rows of ribbons catching pale light through the haze. But her attention never shifted. Her gaze was pinned to Elena Ward. Cross snapped into a rigid salute, trying to recover authority by formality. "General, we secured—" Monroe didn't glance at him. She walked past his outstretched hand as though he were part of the rubble. She stopped in front of Elena, who still gripped the rifle across her chest, her posture unassuming yet immovable. "Master Sergeant Ward," Monroe said, voice low but carrying across the compound. "Or should I still call you Ghost?" The name rippled outward like a shockwave. Soldiers who hadn't dared whisper now froze, eyes darting between their clerk and the commanding officer who had spoken the impossible. Elena stood tall without meaning to. Her body remembered how to square shoulders under scrutiny, how to lock her chin even when her heart pounded. She answered evenly, though the weight of the name pressed against her chest. "Ma'am, I'm assigned as administrative support." The faintest quirk touched the general's mouth. Not anymore. Cross's neck flushed red. He forced a scoff, though it came out weak. "General, with all due respect, she's a file pusher. She shouldn't even be—" Monroe's eyes cut to him, sharp as a blade. "Captain, the only reason this outpost still breathes is because your file pusher executed a shot none of your riflemen would attempt, let alone make. If you want to discuss unqualified, perhaps start with your own decisions today." The air around them tightened. Men glanced at one another, careful not to grin, but the message was clear. Cross's authority had just been gutted in public by the highest-ranking officer most of them would ever see in person. Mason Lee tried to mask his expression, but inside triumph welled. He had known, seen, what Elena could do. Hearing the general speak it aloud felt like vindication. Elena's jaw clenched. She had not wanted this, had not wanted her cover stripped bare in front of men who yesterday wouldn't have trusted her with a sidearm. "Ma'am, I requested discharge. I left that life behind." Monroe lifted a tablet from one of her aides, her thumb sliding across the screen. She read aloud with deliberate care. "Operation Iron Dagger, Kandahar Province. 2 snipers held a ridge against overwhelming odds to protect a downed pilot. One listed Kia. The other," she raised her eyes, "was marked deceased as well, though not by enemy hands. By choice." Gasps threaded through the ranks. Mason felt his heart hammer. Cross stumbled a step back as though struck. Monroe closed the tablet, tucking it under her arm. "That was you. You survived. And you vanished." Elena said nothing. Dust whirled between them, carrying the faint smell of burned fuel. Monroe stepped closer, her voice soft enough that only those nearest could hear. You thought hiding in paperwork would bury the name, but legends don't stay buried, Ghost. They resurface when the world most needs them. Elena's grip on the rifle tightened. I didn't want to be a legend. I wanted to be left alone. Monroe's eyes softened for half a breath, then hardened again. That choice ended the moment you took that shot. Cross sputtered, his pride shredding. General, we can't just. She's not fit for. Enough. Monroe's tone cracked like a whip. I watched the feed from reconnaissance drones before we landed. I saw the rounds strike the enemy commander. Do you know what your men were doing at that moment, Captain? Firing blind into smoke. Do you know what she was doing? Ending the assault in one trigger pull. You may command this company, but you don't command reality. The silence that followed burned hotter than the midday sun. Cross's mouth closed. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time since the attack began, he looked small. Monroe turned back to Elena. I'm reactivating you to operational status, effective immediately. Task Force 88 needs you. Consider this no longer a request. The words hit like another blast. Mason's head spun. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This woman, his so-called staff sergeant, being pulled back into a world reserved for shadows and myths. Elena's eyes dropped to the dirt. She wanted to argue, wanted to resist. But even as she searched for refusal, her body betrayed her. Her stance straightened, her mind already mapping threats and contingencies. The part of her she had buried answered the call before her lips could. Mason saw it in her. The struggle, the flicker of pain when confronted with the past. She whispered, so soft he barely caught it. I'm not ready, Monroe heard. The general leaned closer, her expression unyielding. You're already doing it. Readiness isn't a choice, it's who you are. The Delta operators around them shifted subtly, as though acknowledging her re-entry. One or two even let their eyes linger with something like relief. Ghost wasn't dead. Cross finally spoke, his tone small. I didn't know. Elena turned her head, meeting his gaze. You weren't supposed to. Her voice was calm, not cruel, because I wanted it that way. For once, the captain had no retort. Monroe gestured to an aide who produced a small case. Inside gleamed a set of dog tags, metal dulled with age. She pressed them into Elena's palm. Your true identity, locked away the day the report marked you dead. Time to wear them again. Elena closed her hand around the tags, the chill of the steel seeping into her skin. The sound of distant rotors, the smell of dust and blood, the eyes of every soldier on her, all of it pressed down at once. She slid the tags over her neck, tucking them beneath her vest. The weight was both alien and familiar, a yoke she had once carried proudly and abandoned in grief. Mason's throat tightened, watching the moment. For him, it felt like witnessing history. For Elena, it was the burial of the last illusion she could cling to. Monroe straightened, her tone final. Welcome back, Master Sergeant Ward. Ghost is no longer a shadow. She's part of this fight again. The soldiers around them stood frozen, the revelation sinking deep. They had fought beside a ghost, bled under her protection, survived because she had chosen to step out of hiding, and Cross, stripped of his pride, reduced in front of his own men, could only stare at the ground, knowing his command would never feel the same again. Camp Resolute smelled of burnt powder and dust, the acrid perfume of a battlefield barely won. Medics hustled between rows of wounded, engineers shored up sagging barriers, and soldiers scavenged ammunition from the fallen. Yet even in the aftermath, the weight of revelation hung heavier than the smoke. Elena Ward stood apart, her hand unconsciously brushing the dog tags resting under her vest. The metal pressed against her collarbone like a brand, one she had carried before, one she had sworn never to wear again. Now it was back, gleaming faintly with the truth of who she really was. General Monroe didn't give her time to process. She produced a sealed folder, its edges marked with red classification stamps, and held it out with deliberate gravity. "Operation Silent Storm," she said. "Your next assignment." Elena hesitated before taking it. Her fingers traced the embossed lettering. She had seen hundreds of such folders in her career, but this one felt different. Inside, she sensed, was not just intelligence. Inside was the thread tying her past to her future. She opened it carefully. Photographs spilled across the page, satellite images of mountain passes, blurred profiles of men in desert garb, intercepted communications coded in jargon only a handful could decode. At the center was one name circled in bold: Khalid Rashidi. Her breath caught. The architect of ambushes stretching back years. The same network that had turned Operation Iron Dagger into a bloodbath, that had stolen her spotter Stevens from her side. Monroe's voice softened just enough to show respect. "The man you dropped today wasn't just another insurgent commander. He was trained by Rashidi's people. That strike was no coincidence, it was bait. They knew you might reveal yourself." Elena closed the file slowly, her pulse steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "So now they know I'm alive." "They do," Monroe admitted. "But they're also afraid. We've monitored chatter since your shot. They're rattled, Ghost. They thought you buried. Instead, you proved you're still out here, still lethal." Mason Lee, lingering nearby, listened with wide eyes. He didn't dare speak, but every word drove home how far above his world this truly was. Elena's voice was calm, but a shadow crossed her face. "I asked for discharge because I wanted peace. I wanted to serve without being a weapon." Monroe studied her carefully. "And yet, when the moment came, you picked up that rifle without hesitation. That's who you are. Ghost doesn't die because paperwork says so." The truth bit hard. Elena looked toward the ridgeline bathed in fading light. That golden horizon marked where she had changed everything with one impossible trigger pull. It also marked where her anonymity ended. She closed the folder and handed it back. "I'll need time. 3 years away is a long time." Colonel Harker, the Delta operator who had first recognized her, stepped closer, his helmet tucked under one arm. His voice was low, gruff. "Time doesn't erase skill. What you did today proves that. You're still Ghost, whether you want the name or not." Cross finally found words, though they emerged cracked. "All this time, I called you dead weight." His eyes lowered, shame carving lines deeper than fatigue. "And you carried us through." Elena met his gaze. "You couldn't have known. I made sure no one did. Warriors don't advertise, Captain. They just serve." He nodded faintly, unable to hold her stare. Monroe turned, gesturing to her aides. "We leave in 30 minutes. Extraction is waiting. Pack what you need." She paused, her eyes pinning Elena again. "Ghost, the fight isn't over. Silent Storm is only beginning." The general moved away, her detail flowing around her like water. Soldiers parted instinctively, their eyes following her, then swinging back to Elena. The air buzzed with disbelief, with the sense that they had fought beside. Something more than human, though she was only flesh and bone. Mason stepped forward cautiously. "What happens now?" Elena exhaled slowly, letting the dust sting her lungs. She looked at him, the young private who had seen more truth than anyone else here. Now I stop hiding." And I finish what started years ago." He swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'll follow you anywhere." A faint smile ghosted her lips, the first hint of softness since the firefight began. "Then listen, survive. That's how you honor what we lost today." The sun dipped lower, bleeding gold into the ruins of Camp Resolute. Helicopters spun their rotors, ready to pull her back into the world she thought she had escaped. Elena glanced once more at the ridge, the place where her secret had burned away with the smoke of a single round. She remembered Stevens's laugh, the last words they'd shared before darkness swallowed him. She remembered burying Ghost under layers of silence. Now Ghost had been unearthed, not by choice, but by necessity. And as the rotors lifted grit into the air, she accepted the truth. Warriors don't retire, they wait, and her waiting was over. She stepped toward the helicopter, rifle slung, dog tags cold against her skin, her shadow stretching long behind her. Men watched silently, some saluting, others simply staring. To them, she wasn't a secretary anymore. She was the ghost who had returned, and the storm she was walking into belonged to her alone. The bird lifted, carrying her toward mountains where old debts waited to be settled. Below, Camp Resolute shrank into a scar on the desert floor. Above, the sky opened like a stage for the next chapter of her war, and Elena Ward, once forgotten, now carried the weight of legend on her shoulders again. The dust has settled, but the story of Ghost has only just begun. In one impossible shot, Elena Ward revealed what no one at Camp Resolute expected. The quiet woman in admin fatigues was a legend thought long dead. She silenced an enemy commander, shattered an assault, and reminded the world that warriors cannot truly disappear. But every victory carries a price. By exposing herself, Ghost has drawn the eyes of an old adversary. The file-stamped Silent Storm is more than an operation name. It is a summons back into the shadows she once fled. What would you do if the past you buried returned with such force? If the world demanded you step once more into the fire you swore never to touch? This is not the end. It is the beginning of a reckoning years in the making. Ghost is walking again, and those who thought her gone now know she is coming for them. You've been watching Veteran Biker. If this story struck you, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of hidden battles and unsung heroes. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what moment of this tale hit you the hardest? Thank you for riding with us. And, as always, check out the videos on your screen for more stories of grit, survival, and warriors who refuse to fade.